Well, thank you. And thank you all for being here. I really do appreciate it. I need to start off by explaining what this talk is not about, because it's not about Islam, the religion. I'm not a religious studies scholar, and I am not a Muslim. I'm a political scientist. I teach courses mostly in international relations and comparative politics. And in particular, I teach a range of courses on security topics, including war, terrorism, and ethnic conflict. So I just want everybody to be clear from the outset that this talk is about Islamophobia, and that it is from more of a security studies perspective than a religious studies perspective. Okay? Now, in the time available to us today, I just want to make 3 key points to you on this important topic. That it's real, and actually it's been getting worse. That it's wrong, and in more ways than one. And that it is dangerous. Now, that last point you'll notice is right in the title. And in many ways, that's kind of the takeaway message here today. And to anybody out there watching this who's going into it with some degree of skepticism, I challenge you to at least hear me out to the end. Because ultimately, Islamophobia is actually increasing the threat of terrorism. But more on that in just a few minutes. All right, first of all, what are we talking about here? Well, Islamophobia refers to a pattern of bigotry or prejudice targeting Islam and anything perceived as being associated with that religion. What you see in this particular demonstration is one of the common themes that comes up a lot, Islamization. That's the notion that Islam is somehow trying to take over America or the world, ignoring the fact that Muslim Americans are barely 1% of the population, so not exactly poised for a takeover. But it goes beyond demonstrations to include calls for Muslims to be monitored, or as we've heard in this current presidential campaign that we're all suffering through, to be blocked from entering the country, right? But it goes even farther still to include attacks of various sorts, from vandalism, relatively low-level stuff you see here, on up to physical attacks on people, in some cases even people who aren't Muslim but were mistakenly perceived as being Islamic, have been attacked. And including arson attacks. There have actually been arson attacks on mosques and Muslim schools and centers in the United States, in Canada, and in several different countries in Europe. So this is a problem that's on the rise, and it's on the rise on both sides of the Atlantic. And let's be clear here, the FBI tracks this kind of stuff. They have hate crime data that shows a clear, sharp increase in hate crimes targeting Muslims, beginning in particular around 2010 and maintaining a sustained, heightened level since that time. So this is a real problem. Now, in between incendiary speech and actual attacks, there's a huge amount of threatening behavior going on. Most of it tends to hide behind the relative anonymity of the internet or phone calls, but occasionally it's a whole lot more blunt than that. Consider, for example, just last year in Texas, where a heavily armed small group of protesters gathered in front of a mosque. The sign, if you could see it there, says "Solution to Islamic Terrorism" with an arrow pointing to the gun. Several of them are masked. Notice the skull mask there. This can only be described as threatening and intimidating behavior. And try to imagine how differently people might have reacted had, say, the KKK held a heavily armed gathering in front of a synagogue or a predominantly black Christian church, for example. All right? But it's wrong. And it's wrong in several different ways at once. All right? Morally, ethically, in a country founded on religious freedom. But I want to stress that at the core of all patterns of prejudice, there is, at its essence, a tendency to take the actions of a few and generalize to an entire category of human beings. In many ways, that's what all prejudice is built around. So if you think about some of these signs, looking at the one on the bottom right there, all I need to know about Islam I learned on 9/11. Let's take a closer look at that guy. Could you imagine somebody holding a sign saying, for example, all I need to know about black people I learned from inner city gang violence? Most of you would correctly immediately identify that as a racist statement. How about all I need to know about Italian Americans I learned from Al Capone? Now, if that one sounds a little outdated, I did that on purpose. Because ultimately, as you go back through American history, just about every wave of immigrants and just about every minority in this country has been on the receiving end of prejudice at one time or another, and those things rise and fall. They ebb and flow over time. But basic themes tend to come out each time. Those people are a threat. Those people are too different from us. Those people are going to change our society forever. Those people are going to ruin our democracy. See, when my grandparents came to this country from Italy, a lot of people still viewed Italians as dangerous. We were supposedly, especially Southern Italians, like my grandparents, we were supposedly all mafiosi, right? Pro-criminal people, very dangerous folks. My dad is old enough to remember having experienced some of that in his own life when he was a young man. Fast forward to my life, though, and that has not only diminished, I can honestly tell you in my own experience, most people's reaction to my last name and the Italian heritage it implies has been overwhelmingly positive. Even if along the way, people occasionally still say silly things they probably shouldn't, like assuming that I must be into pasta and red wine. To be clear, that's still technically a stereotype, if a less problematic one, though I'll also admit in my case it happens to be true, so guilty as charged. All right, so these things rise and fall at different points in history, and there is hope. There is the potential for these patterns to diminish. As you go back through American history, Irish immigrants, Polish immigrants, Chinese immigrants, everybody's been on the receiving end of the same basic pattern of prejudice. You can go all the way back to the earliest years of the United States of America and find people who were complaining there were too many Germans moving to America, and if we didn't do something about it, we were going to lose our identity as an English-speaking country. Now, some folks will say, no, but this time is different because now it's about a religion, not just a nationality or an ethnicity that doesn't fit in here, an inherently dangerous and different religion. Well, first of all, Judaism is a religion, and we've certainly had problems with anti-Semitism. We still do. But I want to spotlight another one that too many people have forgotten about, and that's why I bring it up. You see, for a very long time in American history, huge numbers of people felt there were too many Catholics coming to this country, and that they were a threat. See, the argument was Catholics' first loyalty is to the Pope. So in what was sometimes referred to as the papist plot against America, Catholics were going to come here in big numbers, have large family sizes, as they tended to historically, and once there were enough of them here, they were going to be electing their own into political office, and that was the beginning of the end of American democracy, because the Pope could call up, say, President Kennedy and tell him what to do, and he'd have no choice but to follow. Of course, it never materialized like that, and fast forward to today, most people have forgotten about that, even though it was a prevalent problem for a very long time in this country. And just as a metric of how far we've come, I bet most of you didn't even know, the Supreme Court of the United States currently, and for the last several years, has no Protestants on it. They're all Jewish and Catholic. And hardly anybody noticed or cares. Though to be clear, anti-Semitism continues to be a problem. All right, so the problem here is this is wrong for a lot of reasons, but it's also wrong in not just the normative sort of value judgment sense in the context of the patterns of prejudice in this country's history. It's also wrong in the much simpler sense of the word, meaning inaccurate. It's just plain based on misperceptions. If we go back to this sign again, if you're going to take the actions of a few and generalize to a whole category of human beings, you're already mistaken in what you think about those people. Try to imagine somebody in another country who knows nothing about Christianity and then they watch a documentary on the KKK and go, now I know what Christianity is. Same basic problem, actually, and it really is. All right, now, that's why it's so important that a lot of people, especially a lot of Muslims, are spending a lot of time trying to set the record straight, trying to teach people what Islam really is to replace all that misinformation. But as I said at the outset, that's not what I'm here for. That's not my place. A lot of people are doing good work on that front, and I'll leave that to them. But as somebody who studies war, violence, terrorism, I'm struck by how many misconceptions there are about the nature of the terrorist threat, because it is a very real threat, but it's a very misunderstood threat. So, for example, I hear people say things like, well, if there's no connection between Islam and terrorism, why is it that all terrorists are Muslims? Newsflash, folks, they're not. Second deadliest terrorist attack in American history, Oklahoma City, 2 domestic terrorists, Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols. How about the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, another domestic terrorist who has eluded authorities for years as he sent mail bombs to various locations. I could give you dozens of examples of other terrorists who have absolutely no connection to Islam whatsoever. Sometimes people will say, all right, but there's something about that religion because it keeps getting invoked by all these folks, and you don't see people claiming to be carrying out atrocious attacks in the name of Christianity. Let me introduce you to Eric Rudolph, who bombed the Olympic Games in Atlanta, Georgia in 1996. He bombed several other locations around those years, including a couple of abortion clinics and a gay nightclub. He believes that he is a devout Catholic Christian and that he was acting on behalf of his beliefs. Now, most of you are thinking, okay, but that's not representative of Christianity. Right, it's not. That's absolutely correct. How about Joseph Kony? You remember him? The Kony 2012 video that went viral a few years ago? He has been responsible since the 80s for thousands of abductions, child soldiers, mass rape, mass killing, mutilation. He's one of the most wanted and most heinous war criminals in the world. He thinks he's a Christian prophet. His rebel group is called the LRA, Lord's Resistance Army. He thinks he's got a Christian militia. Now, most of you are sitting there thinking, yeah, but come on, that's not Christianity. That's outrageous. How dare he? That's the opposite of Christianity. Right. Yes, that's exactly the correct response. And that's the correct response when we see ISIS burn somebody alive and say they're doing it in the name of Islam. That's not Islam. Okay? Now, sometimes the inaccuracies and the illogic in these arguments are even more obvious than that. You don't even have to go look something up to see some of these flaws. I'll give you one easy example. Several years ago, a Muslim American young woman won the Miss USA beauty pageant, which, by the way, was owned by Donald Trump. At the time, a lot of people felt inclined to argue, well, this is further evidence of the Islamization of America. Now, think that through for a second. These folks think America is somehow going to turn into this, and their evidence that that process is already underway is this? Do I really have to explain it? All right. Now, the good news is that there's plenty of pushback. There are always more moderates, more reasonable people than hardline and intolerant folks. So, as people demonstrated against the so-called Ground Zero Mosque, which, by the way, was never going to be a mosque, it was going to be a community center, there were counter-demonstrators saying, hey, that's un-American. This country was founded on religious freedom. What are you doing? Across the street from that armed protest outside of a mosque more recently in Texas, I just talked about a few minutes ago, are counter-demonstrators saying, hey, that's un-Christian. What are you doing? Standing next to a man deliberately desecrating the Muslim holy book, the Quran, is someone calling him out for being a bigot. So there's plenty of pushback. All right, now if we're going to replace people's misunderstanding of the terrorist threat with an accurate understanding of that threat, I suggest starting with the simple recognition that even if you added up all of the so-called jihadi fighters in the world and all these different terrorist groups, the ones who are actually violent threats, you end up with a number that by any reasonable estimate is less than 1% of the world's roughly 1.5 billion Muslims. And that other 99% is the key. See, that moderate majority is, first of all, the primary victims. The vast majority of terrorist attacks are not happening in Europe and other Western countries like the United States. As tragic as those attacks are, they're actually relatively rare. Far more terrorist attacks are happening on a daily basis in predominantly Muslim countries with ongoing civil wars and insurgencies, and the vast majority of their victims are Muslims. So when you think of it like that, it immediately starts to look more like a common enemy, and you can immediately see the basis for a cooperative relationship between moderate Muslims and non-Muslims working against that common enemy. Now, one of the themes I hear come up a lot is, hey, if there are moderate Muslims out there, why aren't they stopping this? Why aren't they working against this? What are they doing about this? And again, we've got to start replacing this misinformation with accurate understanding. Not only do major terrorist attacks consistently get condemned by Muslim groups all over the world, expressions of solidarity for the victims, not only do you have lots of Muslims working very hard against radicalization and recruitment for these agencies, but you've got moderate Muslims, for example, are the primary soldiers on the ground fighting ISIS in the Middle East right now. The overwhelming majority of the soldiers physically fighting ISIS right now are other Muslims. But even here in Western countries, there are cases that get ignored at our peril. You see, we have a tendency to pay a lot of attention to the terrorist attacks that actually happened, and of course we should. We tend, however, to overlook the terrorist attacks that didn't happen, and we miss learning valuable lessons. For example, just last year, this man and one accomplice were convicted in Canada. They were plotting an attack on a passenger rail line that travels between New York City and Toronto. They were caught, arrested, and convicted, and given life sentences before anybody got hurt. Why? As Canadian authorities emphasized considerably, a fellow Muslim and member of their mosque was concerned about them and alerted authorities, probably saving lives. You may remember the underwear bomber, Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib. From northern Nigeria, he was armed and trained in Yemen by a major affiliate of Al-Qaeda. His bomb failed to detonate on an inbound passenger plane on Christmas Day, coming in for a landing in Detroit several years ago. So we got lucky on that one, but a lot of people missed another lesson in this particular failed attack. Back in Nigeria, his Muslim father went to the U.S. Embassy to let us know his son had become a threat. His dad, think about that for a second. I could give you lots of examples like this. Proven track record of helpful thwarting of attacks. Well, what about, say, Muslims who, during an attack, are actively saving lives, even saving lives of non-Muslims? How about just recently in Paris, about a year and a half ago, while the attacks against the Charlie Hebdo satirical magazine were taking place, there was an attack on the same day against a Jewish supermarket, a kosher supermarket. This young man, who is both Muslim and an African immigrant to France, was an employee there. He saved lives by ushering customers into the back and hiding them in the walk-in cooler, which he then turned off, good thinking, before sneaking out to go try and alert authorities. And he's been hailed as a hero in France. Or even more recently, in fact, just a couple months ago in northern Kenya, I bet none of you heard about this one. This Muslim man was traveling on a bus that was hijacked by the Al-Shabaab terrorist group based out of Somalia, another Al-Qaeda affiliate. The terrorists wanted to separate out the Muslims and Christians on the bus so they could kill all the Christians. Several of the Muslims, including this man, refused. He was shot, and after this photo was taken, he has since died of his wounds. He died protecting Christians from Islamist terrorists. You see, ultimately, Islamophobia isn't just wrong, it's dangerous, and for several reasons. But you don't have to take my word for it. If there are any skeptics out there still listening at this point, you can listen to some of the top national security advisors in America making the same basic point. I'll give you a few examples. Several years ago, when this man in Florida was about to deliberately burn stacks of the Muslim Holy Book and upload the video online, among the many people who spoke out in criticism of this, General David Petraeus, the man who literally wrote the book on America's new military counterinsurgency strategy, also former head of the CIA. More recently, when Donald Trump made his controversial comments about barring all Muslims' entry into the United States, lots of criticism from all circles. Among them, for example, a retired American general named Hadley, Michael Hadley, who was former CIA director and former NSA director. He spoke out and called Trump's suggestion destructive. When Ted Cruz in the current campaign suggested that Muslim neighborhoods should be monitored, the police commissioner of New York City spoke out in very sharp terms against that and pointed out that Senator Cruz doesn't know anything about counterterrorism, and went on to point out that the NYPD has hundreds of officers who are Muslim Americans and that many of them are combat veterans of the U.S. military. You see, it's dangerous because you are fueling the fire. When you do something like this and upload it online, you're handing propaganda directly to the extremists, that barely 1% or less that's trying to recruit from the other 99% of Muslims and radicalize them. Love this kind of stuff. You desecrate their holy book and it confirms their message. You're reinforcing their worldview. See, those small numbers of Islamist radicals who really are a danger, their worldview is that this is a global existential war between Islam and the West. It isn't. Why would we help them reinforce that narrative by echoing and repeating it ourselves? We're playing right into their hands, playing right into their strategy. Okay. Now, I've heard a lot of people in recent months say, we're tired of being lectured on Islamophobia. And I had to think about that a lot as I was preparing this lecture on Islamophobia. My answer is, okay, then you need to study up on counterterrorism strategy and counterinsurgency strategy, and I'd be happy to recommend some readings. If you do, what you'll quickly learn is that developing cooperative relationships with moderates within each of these communities isn't just an element of good counterinsurgency and counterterrorism strategy. It's the central element. Everything pivots around that. It's actually the linchpin. To the extent that we get moderates to work with us and marginalize and work against the much smaller number who are really a violent threat, we're winning. To the extent that we drive the moderates away by, say, insulting their entire religion and telling them we think they're all evil, we're already losing. We're undermining our own national security goals. You see, when the enemy is hiding among a civilian population, that civilian population becomes the key to winning or losing. That's why it is so important to understand that criticism of Islamophobia isn't just coming from Muslim Americans and others. It isn't just coming from liberals. It isn't just coming from academics. It's coming from many of our top national security leaders who know all too well, people who've devoted their lives to protecting all of us, that Islamophobia isn't just wrong in the sense that it's unethical, un-American. It isn't just wrong in the sense that it's fundamentally inaccurate. Islamophobia is making the threat greater. It is undermining our national security goals. Islamophobia is dangerous. Thank you.